You ready? I'm ready. All right, so the second lecture is going to be mostly on the fat-soluble vitamins. I do have a couple of the water-soluble vitamins to finish up. These ones, the story is relatively quick, so I'll go through these quickly. As you're studying, I would spend the amount of time I spent on talking about something. That's proportionally how much time I would spend studying that. Okay, that kind of gives you that's a pretty good clue. I didn't spend talk about something for a long time and then not ask you any questions and then just ask you questions on the stuff we just talked about real shortly. But anyway, so there's a couple of water-soluble vitamins we have left to go through. Riboflavin. So we just talked about niacin. That was NAD. Riboflavin is used to make FAD. We don't really have a well-characterized deficiency. So the deficiency causes these non-specific symptoms, dermatitis. You see dermatitis with so many vitamin deficiencies, it doesn't really tell you much. And we also don't have a toxicity, known toxicity with this vitamin, just like all the water-soluble vitamins except B6. Okay, so although this is an absolutely critical compound, as you will see, we're going to use FAD for a lot of things. You don't generally see a shortage of it, and it's not toxic. So therefore, the story, we don't know any really human diseases there. The story becomes fairly boring. Biotin. This is an enzyme. Biotin's always used in carboxylation reactions in the human body. Biotin deficiency is also very rare. It's very widely distributed in food, and it's also normal flora in the gut synthesize biotin, so you don't very often see a biotin deficiency. Okay. Now you may see this story somewhere where raw eggs, they actually contain a protein that binds, this avidin actually binds biotin, actually binds it very, very tightly. Maybe some of you have actually taken advantage of that. This is actually used in the lab for a binding reaction. We take advantage of that. So we coat beads with this avidin, and then you can label things with biotin and pull them out of a solution. So sometimes you'll see this mentioned. Once you cook an egg, the avidin is broken up, so it no longer binds the biotin real strongly. But as it turns out, you have to eat about the equivalent of something like 20 raw eggs a day in order to really cause a biotin deficiency. So this is really not of that much concern. I don't think anybody's eating 20 raw eggs a day, are they? If you have a patient who does that, you might want to recommend they don't. There is a genetic disease. It's a rare genetic disease, but multiple carboxylase deficiency. Carboxylase enzymes require biotin, and this enzyme deficiency is a defect in the ability to attach the biotin to the enzyme, and that particular genetic disease is responsive to high doses of biotin. So you can actually, if you give enough biotin, it'll overcome this deficiency, at least to a certain extent. And once again, the symptoms of a biotin deficiency are pretty non-specific. Okay, you can certainly see any of those symptoms in other things. So it's going to be hard to diagnose something as a particular biotin deficiency. You're really going to have to, if you really thought it was a biotin deficiency, you would have to really come up with a way of trying to look at these carboxylase enzymes. And then finally, for the water-soluble vitamins, we have this pantothenic acid, or vitamin B12. This is a component of coenzyme A. You see coenzyme A all over the place in so many different reactions. And if you haven't seen it yet, you will be tired of seeing it before this class is over. But pantothenic acid is one of those things that's so widely distributed, it's found everywhere. So we don't. It's not known to be toxic. So we don't have a characterization of an excess, and we really don't have a well-characterized deficiency of it either. So although, and actually, so you'll see some of the most vital compounds actually are so widespread that there's really no well-characterized deficiency. Pantothenic acid, certainly it's an important component, but you don't normally see a deficiency of it. Okay, so now we can move on to talking about fat-soluble vitamins. There's only 4 of them. You'll notice I do expect you to know what they are, A, D, E, and K. If you know those, then you know everything else is water-soluble. Okay, so the first one we're going to go through, and if I remember right, I didn't do them exactly in alphabetical order. I think we're going A, D, K, E, but almost in alphabetical order. So first we're going to talk about vitamin A, or the retinoids. So they are a family of compounds related to dietary retinol. So the form in which vitamin A ultimately gets used, first of all, it depends on what its function is going to be. And you can see there's 2 very, very, very dramatically different functions for vitamin A. It's kind of cool in that regard that they're really radically different functions for vitamin A. But there's multiple forms. And if you look at this, I'm never going to ask you to draw this out, but there's not much difference. We have an alcohol group there, we have an aldehyde group there, we have a carboxylic acid group there, and then here we just changed from a trans to a cis conformation. So we're just interconverting, and depending on whether it came in the diet, it's being stored, if it's being used for vision, which is one thing it can be used for, or it's being used as to affect gene expression, which is another thing it can be used for. Depends on which form you see. They're all called vitamin A. And also we throw in beta-carotene into there, which is a form of vitamin A that's found in plants. It's essential for vision, which is going to be very different from all of its other roles, which include reproduction, growth, maintenance of epithelial tissue. It's also regulates immune proliferation of those types of cells. So all of these other second reactions are due to its effect on gene expression. So it's got a role in vision, which has nothing at all to do with gene expression. It's actually a physical role for the vitamin, and then it's got these roles in gene expression, where it's acting like a fat-soluble hormone. We've already talked about cortisol, for example. So both vitamin A and vitamin D act as fat-soluble hormones. Retinol is the storage and transport form. There we go. Retinoic acid is going to be the biologically active form for its gene expression functions. And then this 11-cis-retinal is going to be its active form for vision. Okay. Now, beta-carotene can actually be converted into 2 molecules of retinol. So this is another source of ultimately vitamin A. The conversion is relatively inefficient, though. So beta-carotene doesn't yield as much vitamin A. And actually, you're going to see vitamin A and vitamin D, you can absolutely overdose on those. And the symptoms can be very severe. But you typically won't overdose on beta-carotene. Okay, you're going to have to get another form of vitamin A to really overdose on. Absorption and transport. Now, one of the common themes you're going to see here is we're talking about fat-soluble vitamins. So all fat-soluble vitamins, they're not water-soluble, they're soluble in fat, so we're going to transport them with fat. So that's kind of critical to understanding where you might see some of the deficiencies as well. So typically vitamin A, unless it's in the beta-carotene form, is going to exist as a retinol ester. Okay, so basically it's just attached to a fatty acid. That's typically how it gets stored in the tissues you're going to get in your diet, these animal-derived tissues. and it's going to be transported into the intestinal cell. Beta carotene will actually be converted in the intestinal cell to ultimately to retinol. But anyway, ultimately these forms of vitamin A end up in the intestinal cell, and what ends up happening is we're actually going to re-esterify them if they were all originally esterified. But regardless of what form it came in, we're going to esterify them. That means attach it to a fatty acid, and it's going to actually be transported in the chylomicron. Talked about chylomicrons yet? If you haven't talked about them yet, these are just going to be these. Basically, you can think of it as this is how you're going to transport fats. Any fat you get in your diet or anything that's soluble in fat is going to end up at a chylomicron and sent into the bloodstream. Chylomicrons have a phosphate group outside, so they're water soluble on the outside, and then inside they contain all these very water insoluble things, including your fat soluble vitamins. So this holds true for all of the fat soluble vitamins. They'll all be transported in the chylomicrons. The liver is actually where you're going to actually store vitamin A. So you'll see the fat-soluble vitamins, you actually store significant amounts of them. When it's actually needed, retinol will be released from the liver and transported to whatever tissues it's needed. Now, it is fat-soluble, so it's not water-soluble. Just like with any fat-soluble compound, it doesn't usually exist in the serum by itself. It has to be attached to something to make it soluble. And in this case, we have a retinol binding protein. And that's going to, whatever cells need that vitamin A will produce the appropriate receptors and pull in the vitamin A. In most cells, this retinol is actually oxidized to retinoic acid, which is its biologically active form. This is the form where it's actually going to act to affect gene expression. So just like with the story of cortisol, this is a fat-soluble hormone in this case, and actually crossed a membrane, and therefore it had an intracellular receptor. There's a receptor inside the cell that's going to bind to this retinoic acid, and by causing that binding, you've now made an active transcription factor. Very, very similar to the story we saw earlier when we had cortisol and the binding to its intracellular receptor and then binding ultimately to those GREs, right? Same idea here, and actually you'll see the same thing with vitamin D, okay? So we're making these active transcription factors that are going to ultimately affect gene expression. And so these receptors are part of the same superfamily that includes the nuclear receptors for hormones, for steroid hormones, like cortisol, for example. Vitamin D is going to be in the same group. These are all compounds. They cross the membrane. They have an intracellular receptor. Once they bind to its intracellular receptor, now you have an active transcription factor. They go in the nucleus and they actually affect gene expression. Now, vitamin A has a very different role in vision. Okay, so this is completely different from its role as a transcription factor. Okay, so in vision, that all-trans retinol, which we saw on an earlier slide, is actually interconverted to an 11-cis retinal. So it puts a kink in it, and that's actually important for its function in vision, where it's actually going to undergo photoisomerization. So it combines with this protein opsin to make rhodopsin. And what ends up happening is this rhodopsin, you can actually have light will actually cleave this rhodopsin and yield the free 11-cis retinol. Actually, it'll convert it back to all-trans retinal. So that's actually what the light does. It isomerizes this compound and yields the free opsin. So I didn't really didn't write the story beyond that, and obviously, vision is a very complicated process. But this light, when light hits this and this cleavage happens, it initiates a chain of events that ultimately, and it's a complicated chain of events, which is why I didn't want to talk about the entire pathway, a chain of events that ultimately results in the neuron detecting that as, okay, that was light. Okay, so there's actually some signal transduction cascades that go beyond this. But this is ultimately where the vitamin A comes in. Okay, light converts that that cis conformation to the trans conformation. You actually break this rhodopsin into the all-trans retinal and opsin, and that initiates a whole signal transduction cascade, which ultimately you perceive as light. Okay, that's kind of cool that vitamin A has these really, I mean, I can't think of something that could be so different, you know, being a physical component of, used for light detection and then affecting gene expression. Really very different things. Once again, these good sources things are FYIs. I'm not going to test you on them. But you know, you can get vitamin A from meat animal sources where, you know, you have fat-soluble spores in those. Or you can get vitamin A from vegetables as well in the form of carotenes. Okay, so what are going to be the symptoms of a vitamin A deficiency? Well, it is involved in vision, right? And what ends up happening is when vitamin A deficiency begins, one of the very first symptoms that you will see is night blindness, okay? It'll change that threshold to actually cause that reaction that we're seeing. So you will, the very first symptom you'll see is night blindness, which eventually can progress into some of these other symptoms, okay? Xerophthalmia, very hard to say, xerophthalmia. That's a pathological dryness of the eye. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with the night blindness, okay? Now, the rest of these symptoms are due to its effect on gene expression, and the genes that vitamin A actually affects are involved in growth, development, and differentiation of various tissues, in particular epithelial tissues. Okay, and so this pathological dryness of the eye is an effect on epithelial tissue. Other epithelial changes. So you're getting eye symptoms here that are both related to the actual perception of light, which is one function, and then the function on gene expression. Okay, immune dysfunction. So people who are vitamin A deficiency tend to be prone to infection. That's because vitamin A is involved in immune cell differentiation. Okay, so growth, development, differentiation of various cell types. Alopecia, that's still an epithelial change. Okay, alopecia is a baldness, not this kind of baldness, but a non-specific baldness. So a dietary deficiency will be, you can actually treat with retinol. You can certainly use beta-carotene. It's not as efficient, so you'll actually treat with retinol. But where do you see a vitamin A deficiency? Well, if you don't eat foods that contain vitamin A, but particularly you can see a vitamin A deficiency if you have a diet that's fat-free, because if you don't have those fats to help absorb and transport that vitamin A, and ultimately that can cause a deficiency in any of the fat-soluble vitamins, or fat malabsorption. So anything that's going to affect the stomach, intestines, and the absorption of fats. And so there's so many different conditions, or the digestion of fats. So pancreatic insufficiency, you can have Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease. All those things can cause a vitamin A deficiency. So when you see a vitamin A deficiency, that might be one of the things you start thinking about. Okay, what's causing it? Check. Okay, you've got a normal diet. You got a normal diet, then we got something else going on. And sometimes that something else going on is very important to figure out because the vitamin A deficiency may be a clue that something else is really wrong. Vitamin A is one of the vitamins, though, you can absolutely get in excess of. Okay, so hypervitaminosis A is the excess of vitamin A. And this is actually toxic. So it can cause dry, itchy skin. This is, once again, vitamin A is involved in the progression, differentiation of epithelial tissue. It also is a growth promoter, which may explain some of the symptoms on the liver and in the brain. So you can actually get this, and actually this can be one of the first clues in a vitamin A deficiency is you get a headache because of that intracranial pressure. I haven't seen an exact explanation of what causes that intracranial pressure, but it could be because of its effect on promoting growth. And it certainly affects bone, so it can actually affect the bones in the skull as well. So, and you'll notice this bone demineralization and this hypercalcemia. One thing you'll notice is, so the next story we're going to talk about is going to be vitamin D. You'll notice there's going to be a little bit of overlap. And so I want you to also think about how would you differentiate vitamin D from vitamin A deficiency. Certainly they're not going to present exactly the same, although there could be some overlap. Now, vitamin A, in particular, pregnant women are advised to not take in excess vitamin A because it's absolutely teratogenic. Okay, that means it will absolutely cause malformations in the fetus. Okay, so that's something you've got to be very careful of. You will see all-trans retinoic acid, or there's tretinoin, used to treat acne and psoriasis. So once again, vitamin A, one of its big jobs is on differentiation of epithelial tissue, which is where you're going to see psoriasis and acne. Also used to, tretinoin is also used to treat this blood disorder, acute promyelocytic leukemia. So once again, it does affect the differentiation and growth of immune cells. So this would be an example of that. So because, though I already told you that vitamin A is extremely teratogenic and absolutely contraindicated, you don't want to get too much in a pregnant woman, but this drug is absolutely contraindicated in women of childbearing potential. That means if you have a woman who you're going to treat for acne or psoriasis with this, they will actually force her, I believe, so don't quote me on this, but I believe they will actually force her to actually prove that she's on birth control. So, but you absolutely do not want to get pregnant when you're on this because it's very much teratogenic. So that's the story of vitamin A. Vitamin D is the next story. It also functions, it doesn't have a special extra function like vitamin A does in vision, but it also functions as a hormone-like manner to affect gene expression. That means it's going to get into cells, it's going to have an intracellular receptor, it's going to bind to that, and when it does, it becomes an active transcription factor. It affects gene expression, okay? So the main function of vitamin D is actually to regulate plasma levels of calcium and phosphorus. Okay? Calcium is probably the one that jumps into your head right away, but it's actually both of those. Distribution of vitamin D. Now you can actually, vitamin D is one of those compounds that's not necessarily a vitamin. So what did I say? How do you define whether something's a vitamin? Something that's required, but you absolutely have to get it in your diet, right? Under the appropriate circumstances, you can actually get 0 vitamin D from your diet and be fine because you can actually synthesize it. So there is an intermediate in the cholesterol biosynthesis, which we'll talk to you later about, 7-dehydrocholesterol. That can actually be converted into cholecalciferol, which is going to be a precursor for vitamin D in the presence of UV light. That means if you get enough exposure to the sun, then you will technically make vitamin D not a vitamin anymore because you're actually producing enough of it yourself. So vitamin D only really becomes a true vitamin if you're not getting enough sun exposure. There's also other forms, ergocalciferol from plants, cholecalciferol, which is what we converted this intermediate in cholesterol biosynthesis to from animal sources. Dietary vitamin D packaged into chylomicrons, just like what happens with vitamin A, right? So that's easy to remember. So vitamin D is only required, once again, with limited sun exposure. Okay, so there's multiple forms of vitamin D, and ultimately you have to go through a couple processing events before you get the most potent and active form of vitamin D, which is going to be this calcitriol. So the cholecalciferol was basically what we started with at the beginning. We can actually store that in the liver. So there is a reaction that takes place in the liver, uses this enzyme 25-hydroxylase. So it's actually going to hydroxylate this cholecalciferol, and it makes a compound called calcidiol. Okay, calcidiol can be stored in the liver. It's also the most prominent form found in the blood. This is very odd because if you actually look, you will actually find that there's actually about 100 times more calcidiol in the blood than calcitriol. But calcitriol is the one that's actually the potent one, the one that is actually going to cause the effects. So a good question, and one which we don't have an answer for yet, is why there's so much of this compared to the active form. But anyway, so you've got a reaction in the liver, and then you've got a second reaction that occurs in the kidney. This uses an enzyme called, a very long name, 25-hydroxycholecalciferol 1-hydroxylase. Actually much easier to say, and very often you will just see, like in this figure, just called 1-hydroxylase. You've got your 25-hydroxylase and your 1-hydroxylase. But ultimately that means there's a second reaction to make the potent active form that occurs in the kidney. So both your liver and your kidneys have to be functioning properly in order to produce vitamin D, to produce the most active form of vitamin D. And this is the key spot where we're actually going to regulate the production of vitamin D, is at this second enzymatic reaction that occurs in the kidney, this 1-hydroxylase enzyme. So, for example, low phosphate. Okay, so remember, the vitamin D is going to regulate the serum levels of calcium and phosphate. So low phosphate is directly going to stimulate vitamin D. Okay, or I'm sorry, it's going to stimulate the production of vitamin D. It's going to directly stimulate this 1-hydroxylase enzyme to produce vitamin D. So the other thing that's going to happen is low calcium is going to indirectly stimulate this 1-hydroxylase to make the potent form of vitamin D. And how this works is via parathyroid hormone. Okay, so parathyroid hormone is going to stimulate 1-hydroxylase, and I'm going to show you the progression of that in the very next slide. Calcitriol, which is the product of the reaction, which is going to be the very active form of vitamin D, actually will feedback inhibit the enzyme. This is a very typical way of regulating an enzyme. When you've got enough of it, you actually shut off the enzyme. Don't keep producing more. So it's under tight regulation. So it's going to be regulated so there's going to be a balance between how much calcitriol is there and how much it's being stimulated by parathyroid hormone and the low levels of phosphate. Okay, so let's go through the progression of how vitamin D actually responds to low calcium, because that's the more common thing you think of with vitamin D. So vitamin D, so it's actually indirectly stimulates the production of vitamin D through this hydroxylase enzyme, because it stimulates the production of the parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone directly stimulates 1-hydroxylase, makes calcitriol. Calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D, and so this parathyroid hormone itself has other effects on calcium mobilization. Both parathyroid hormone and calcitriol stimulate calcium mobilization from bone, so you'll actually take some calcium from bone. You'll also prevent renal loss of calcium, so it affects the kidneys to prevent the loss of calcium in the urine. So you'll increase the resorption and decrease excretion. Now, ultimately, remember, the vitamin D effects are going to be at the level of gene expression. So these are going to take a little while to have an effect. Calcitriol also stimulates the intestinal absorption of calcium. So remember, when vitamin D is the active form is produced, basically that's saying, okay, calcium is low, so we're going to get some calcium from bone. We're going to actually prevent loss in the kidney, and we're going to stimulate the intestinal absorption. So, and here's a specific example I gave you. Calbindin is the expression of the gene for calbindin is actually increased by vitamin D. A deficiency of vitamin D, it's rickets in children and osteomalacia in adults. Basically, those two things are the same condition. It's just that if you have a growing child, because the bones are still growing, it can present a little bit differently, but they're essentially the same thing. So rickets, you get incomplete mineralization resulting in soft, pliable bones. Osteomalacia, you get the net demineralization over time, okay? So where do you actually see a deficiency? And that's actually supposed to be a picture right there of what can happen. And this is actually in osteomalacia, so you're still getting soft bones, and you get the bowing of the bones in this case. Where do you see a deficiency? Well, you can see a deficiency if you don't have exposure to sunlight. So it's more likely to happen in winter. Also, you know, if you're relying on sunlight to produce vitamin D, people with darker skin have less efficient conversion. And that's actually where they think light skin may have actually evolved from, because for those of you who are very pale like me, you know there's not many advantages to having light skin. There seems to be a lot of disadvantages from a biological perspective. You're much more prone to skin cancer. Certainly, you get sunburned all the time, so it doesn't seem to be. But they think maybe because vitamin D many years ago in evolutionary time was a much more hard to come by, that maybe people who grew up in cold climates, and typically light skin is associated with cold climates, that's because they only had a limited exposure. Only parts of their skin were exposed to the sun. So kind of an interesting aside. Dietary milk or breast milk is not a good source of vitamin D. So one of the things you will see is in babies who are being breastfed, you will actually see they will do a vitamin D supplementation, which I have got one at home right now. A little terror, being supplemented daily with vitamin D. So some of the things you're going to see besides the osteomalacia are sort of these effects on bone, liver or kidney damage because of effects on calcium. Hypoparathyroidism can cause, or I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Liver or kidney damage will cause a deficiency of vitamin D. Why is that? Because both liver and the kidney are required to convert vitamin D to the active form, right? Okay. Hyperparathyroidism will also cause a vitamin D deficiency because that's required to actually stimulate the formation of the active form of vitamin D. So you can get renal osteodystrophy. So if you have some type of chronic kidney disease, this is going to affect the ability to make vitamin D. So any patient you have who has some kind of renal failure, one of the things you're going to want to monitor very closely is vitamin D. And you can actually supplement with vitamin D in those patients. Okay. Once again, the sources are for you guys, FYI. Whoops, sorry. I can't see the little arrows down there. We go. Okay. Vitamin D, just like vitamin A, is one of those vitamins which is absolutely toxic in excess. Vitamin D is stored in the body just like vitamin A, so these fat-soluble vitamins, you can store them in fat tissue. And it's slowly metabolized. So if you get high doses of vitamin D, you get too much vitamin D, it can cause hypercalcemia. Okay? So too much vitamin D, it makes sense, right? What happens in a normal situation, what happens is if calcium starts to get low, you make vitamin D, that increases the serum level of calcium. So you might guess, okay, well, if I get too much vitamin D, then I'm going to get a hypercalcemia. That hypercalcemia starts damaging soft tissue. So you can get kidney damage, you can get artery damage. So you actually end up causing a kidney disease with too much vitamin D. Now, high doses of vitamin D can actually cause resorption of calcium from the bone. So one of the weird things about vitamin D excess is it can, in some ways, start to look like a deficiency of vitamin D, because both a deficiency of vitamin D and an excess of vitamin D will cause calcium resorption from the bone. So even though in this case you've already got a hypercalcemia, you got too much vitamin D, you got a hypercalcemia, that because you have all that D, your body thinks, or at least that 1-hydroxylase enzyme thinks there's too little calcium, so it actually produces the active form, and you actually continue to resorb and therefore further compound the hypercalcemia. So vitamin D excess, in addition to all these effects from having too much calcium around, can actually affect the bone in a manner similar to having too little vitamin D. Okay? So it's kind of interesting how that works. Okay, so the next story is vitamin K, and we already alluded to this one a little bit. Its big role is in the post-translational carboxylation of proteins. Is there a question? No? Yes. Oh, he was just trying to get the microphone. Yes.
Since with the bone resorption, you can't really tell if it's a deficiency or an excess, you just test for serum levels of vitamin D?
Yeah, so I'm not exactly, that's a good question. How do you differentiate between? Certainly there would be tests for vitamin D. I don't know which form of vitamin D they actually use or exactly which is the test, but certainly that's something you could do. I'm not sure if that's exactly what they do. Now, because if you're familiar with the whole story, there's multiple different things that are going to be different in there, so I'm not sure which one of them they'll actually test for. You certainly want to, when you get a situation like that, you certainly want to test thyroid function as well. And so there's other things going to be involved. But yeah, you can definitely, you can definitely differentiate between them based on various things. But I'm not familiar with exactly what test you guys would use in a clinical situation. So I don't want to speak on that and tell you something that's wrong, because I can think of various things in there you could possibly test. But that's definitely one of them. So you're thinking along the right lines. Yes, there was another question.
How much vitamin D is too much? Say like a gallon of milk a day.
Actually, a gallon of milk. Okay, so the question was how much vitamin D is too much. The gallon of milk a day is right there on that threshold. Okay, so if you drink, and there are people who do that, and I tell them that is too much vitamin D. Okay, now milk is fortified. The milk you drink is fortified with vitamin D. If it wasn't, you would be okay. But yeah, that's too much milk. Right. But if you want to know the threshold, that's right about it. You drink a gallon of milk a day, you're getting too much vitamin D. Half gallon, you're probably okay. You're still getting too much, but it's not going to cause the symptoms. You get up to about a gallon a day, because I did that calculation before. So it's, how much vitamin D is too much? It's on the order of magnitude. So if you get about 10 times more than the RDA, that's going to be too much. Same with vitamin A in a woman who's not pregnant. It's going to be on that order. Anything else where we're talking about getting like vitamin B6, it's much, 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 much higher than that. So you really have to get a lot. But vitamin D and vitamin A it's realistic to get too much of those, especially if you supplement or if you drink a gallon of milk a day, for example. Yes.
What would the number be in like IUs for like too much vitamin D?
I honestly don't know the IUs off the top of my head, so I couldn't tell you that. So, yeah, it's been a little while since I actually looked at the numbers, and since I didn't want to put it in here, which would remind me what the number is, because I didn't want you guys to try to remember. Because for me, I'm not concerned about that, but so I don't remember the exact IUs. But it's going to be somewhere on the order of 10 times more than whatever the RDA is. So whatever that was, you get in the range of about 10 times more than that, it's too much. Maybe even 5 times more than that. But okay, so the next fat-soluble vitamin we're going to talk about is vitamin K. Actually, I already mentioned in the beginning, it's involved in the post-translational carboxylation. We've already seen that a little bit. But here we're actually seeing the actual blood clotting factors it actually affects. 2, 7, 9, and 10. In order for them to work, these are blood clotting factors, so they're going to be involved in clotting your blood, which can be a normal process, could be an abnormal process, depends on what we're talking about. There's certainly occasions when you want to clot your blood, right? When you cut yourself or something like that. And so these clotting factors require this additional carboxyl group to be added to the someplace on the clotting factor. And actually that carboxyl group, there's actually ends up being 2 carboxyl groups. One of them was already there because it was a glutamate residue. But these carboxyl groups actually bind calcium. So here's another story where calcium comes in. And that's actually important for them to bind to each other and ultimately to clot. And here we're also showing you warfarin. Warfarin is actually a synthetic vitamin K analog. So it looks like vitamin K. It actually interferes with the production of the active form of vitamin K. So warfarin actually creates a vitamin K deficiency. So vitamin K is still there, but you can't regenerate the active form. So it creates a functional vitamin K deficiency. Therefore, you don't produce these proper clotting factors and you can't clot blood. Originally, warfarin was used as a rat poison. So it'll actually, if you give it to, and it works well. It's kind of gross how it works, but it'll actually cause the rats, when you give it to them, to bleed out. But it's actually used as a drug in humans now for people who have conditions where clotting can cause a real problem. So people who have cardiovascular conditions where there's restrictions in those arteries where a clot can cause an occlusion, they will actually use warfarin as a drug. Yes, there's a question?
Yeah, so the vitamin K helps with carboxylation of the glutamate, but the glutamate already has 2 carboxyl groups.
Well, so it's a glutamate. It's inside a protein. Okay, so one of those carboxyl groups that's on a free glutamate is no longer free because it was now part of the peptide bond. So that's no longer a carboxylic acid that's free to be used in the R group. The R group itself only has the 1, right? And so it's adding a second carboxylic acid to the R group. That other carboxylic acid was eliminated when they made the peptide bond. So this is actually within it's not free glutamate. It's a glutamate residue somewhere in the structure of a protein. Okay, so vitamin K deficiency is relatively rare compared to some of the other vitamin deficiencies because vitamin K, you get most of your vitamin K from intestinal bacteria. So then where are you going to see vitamin K deficiency then? Well, if you destroy your intestinal bacteria, you could create a vitamin K deficiency. So when you're taking antibiotics, particularly if you're taking oral antibiotics, and generally you're not trying to knock out your normal flora, but that's one of the things it does. It knocks out your normal flora. It's one of the reasons I like to avoid antibiotics unless it's absolutely required. And so you can see a vitamin K deficiency when you're taking antibiotics. Any kind of intestinal disease can also cause a vitamin K deficiency, both because it could affect the flora, but also it affects absorption, right? Same with all fat-soluble vitamins. Any intestinal disease can affect that. Newborns, though, are particularly prone to vitamin K deficiency. I just told you you get most of your vitamin K from intestinal bacteria. Newborns don't have intestinal bacteria yet. So, and so one of the things, newborns are very prone to bleeding, and you can see that during birth or when they cut the umbilical cord or during circumcision, all these things. So one of the things they're going to do with a newborn is give them a vitamin K injection right away. Within the first few hours, at least they did for us within the first few hours. He was not very happy about it either because they jam it right in the thigh, so it's an intramuscular dose. Vitamin K is really, you have to really get a super excess of vitamin K to be toxic. So vitamin K toxicity is not normally something we're worried about. Yes.
I've heard that vitamin K2 is important for calcium and vitamin D, like absorption for your bones. Is that true?
I've never heard that vitamin K in particular affects vitamin D absorption. They're all going to be absorbed in the same manner. They're all going to end up in chylomicrons. So if you're affecting the absorption of one because of fat malabsorption, you can certainly affect others, but I'm not aware of vitamin K having any direct interaction with vitamin D. I haven't heard that. So if you find anything more on that, you can send it to me, but that's not something I've heard of. And I'm not, so if it's true, I can't predict off the top of my head what that mechanism would be. It's not obvious to me what a mechanism would be between vitamin D and vitamin K. Vitamin E is going to be the last one. Its primary function is as a fat-soluble antioxidant. So that's actually going to prevent lipid peroxidation. So our vitamin C was a good example of a water-soluble vitamin that was an antioxidant. This is our fat-soluble antioxidant. Fat-soluble antioxidants are going to protect fats. They're going to protect membranes. So therefore, if you have a deficiency of it, what it is going to affect is membranes, and that will cause a hemolytic anemia. So the membranes, vitamin E is very important in the membranes of mature red blood cells. It's their antioxidant that's present in the membranes. Remember, they transport oxygen, so they're very susceptible, because they're around oxygen so much, they tend to be oxidized very frequently, and this can actually help with that. And peripheral neuropathy, so once again, it's an effect on the membranes in the peripheral nerves. The most common cause is fat malabsorption. You can see it in premature infants, and it's not generally known to be toxic. Now you'll notice there's actually multiple other slides I've given you in here. We're not going to obviously walk through all those. I love these tables because they're very, very useful to study from, and then you don't have to make your own table. This one comes straight out of your textbook. It's got pretty much all the information right there. There might be a couple things I didn't talk about in there, and certainly I pulled a couple figures out of some Comlex and USMLE review books for you guys to use. Okay, use as you see fit. If there's extra information in there, eventually you'll learn it, but it's not something we talked about, so I'm not going to test you on it. So it's not going to hurt you to learn it, but you'll notice there'll be a little bit of extra information in there, but these are really useful for studying. So I just give them to you for you guys to study, although I don't have to walk through them with you. But all right, so I'll hang around here for a few minutes if you got any questions.